Okay, I'm sure some more people will still filter in after we get started, but I want to make sure that today's speaker has plenty of time to give her talk. So we're delighted today to welcome Anna Petrović from TU Delft, who'll be talking to us about multi-scale measures of population for understanding segregation and spatial context effects. Anna is a postdoc researcher in the Urban Studies group at the Department of Urbanism at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Her research is focused on sociospatial inequalities, segregation, and neighborhood effects. Her work has been published in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers and in Progress in Human Geography. I, for one, am very excited to hear from Anna today. If you haven't joined us before, our speaker will be talking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll hold, if possible, all questions and conversation for after her talk. If you could leave your questions in the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen, then other people can upvote them if they like or comment, and it just helps the discussion move a little bit more quickly after the talk. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this seminar series. I am very happy to participate also as a speaker. And I will now start sharing my screen. Yes. So I hope that you can see now my presentation, and I will be presenting my work that I have been doing together with my PhD supervisors, Martin van Ham from Delft University of Technology and David Manley from the University of Bristol. So this talk will be based on my PhD thesis, and it involves a few papers that have been published already or forthcoming in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. Those are empirical papers where we presented the core of our method and where we presented our study on contextual effects. And also we have a theoretical paper in progress in human geography, which will also be part of this talk. But I will also present some new work that we have been doing on multi-scale measures of segregation. So I'm really happy to hear your comments and questions about our work. The first question is why we actually need these multi-scale measures of population. The place where we live involves everything starting from our immediate surrounding of our home up to a larger spatial context of the city or urban region where we live. And that involves a very different spatial context at multiple spatial scales. And all these spatial contexts, starting from the immediate neighborhood up to a wider urban region, for example, they all change also over time. To understand this, we need multi-scale measures of population, and they are important to study phenomena, very relevant phenomena, such as residential segregation of ethnic and socio-economic groups, which is particularly relevant now in the circumstances of growing economic inequalities and also growing both international and internal migrations. So we need these multi-scale measures of population to understand these causes of residential segregation, but also the consequences of residential segregation, such as economic and social functioning of cities and individual outcomes of people. In my talk, I will focus on how we can use multi-scale measures of segregation of population to better understand residential segregation and also individual outcomes of people. The theory does suggest that we need multi-scale measures of population. So for example, the literature of neighborhood effects, that is the literature that studies how the spatial context, so the place where we live, how it affects our individual outcomes. That literature does suggest that there are multiple mechanisms that operate in our spatial context and that may affect a wide range of individual outcomes of people, such as people's education or their success at the labor market or their health. And for example, peer group effects that operate in the residential context, we can say that they operate in the immediate surrounding of people's homes. While, for example, for studying peer group effects in school, we need a bit larger spatial context to include the schools where children go to. Then, for example, for stigmatization, we can use actually we can use various spatial contexts, because various areas, starting from a bit smaller ones to larger ones, they can be stigmatized for different reasons. And to study, for example, regional labor markets, we then need a larger context. However, if you look at the empirical evidence from the Netherlands, empirical evidence about segregation and about neighborhood effects, then we can see that most studies actually are limited to using a single spatial scale. Furthermore, if you look at segregation, we can see that the evidence about segregation, we can see that it is mostly from cross-sectional studies. And then we also have more empirical evidence in the Netherlands about ethnic than socioeconomic segregation, although socioeconomic segregation is also important, especially if we talk about these individual outcomes of people. Then we also want to know more about trends of socioeconomic segregation as well. Therefore, in our studies, we ask the following questions: how does ethnic and socioeconomic segregation develop over time and spatial scale? How does this differ between different cities in the Netherlands? And how do spatial contexts at multiple spatial scale affect individual outcomes? Specifically in our study, we look at the effects on individual income. These issues are mostly studied using administrative units such as this one. These are officially defined neighborhoods in the city of Amsterdam. And we can say that there are multiple issues with using only a single spatial scale of one predefined administrative units. For example, if we look at this person that lives in a certain neighborhood, and then we have a percentage of people, for example, here we look at the percentage of non-Western neighbors that this person has, and it's about 40%, I'd say, but this person also lives closer to another neighborhood that has much more non-Western people, also to close to another neighborhood that has much less non-Western people. And we also, if we are limited to these administrative units, we don't know what is happening just around the person's home. Also, what is the situation, what are the characteristics of a larger spatial context. And in the literature on the modifiable areal unit problem, you can read a lot about what kind of consequences your empirical analysis can have if you are using various different spatial units. And to address these issues, we use microgeographic data in the Netherlands because in the Netherlands, in the register data include also the spatial unit where each person lives, which is very small, and that is 100 by 100 meter grid cells. So if you compare this map now with the previous map, this map is constructed of a very large number of small grid cells. So these dots that here, the color represents the percentage of non-Western people. It's actually the percentage in a very small area. Specifically, this map has almost 70,000 these small grid cells. So it's really, we start really from a very small scale. And we have these cells, we have this grid cell for the whole country of the Netherlands, which makes in total almost 600,000 small grid cells, 100 by 100 meter grid cells, which are populated in the whole country. So you can imagine how large amount of data this is, but also how useful it can be for our analysis. So then we start from this small cell. Here in this map, we look only at the smallest scale that we have, which is 100 by 100 meter grid cell. But then from this, we can construct areas of different sizes. We start from the smallest scale. So let's say this one person lives in an area in a cell 100 by 100 meter, where they have only 7% of low-income neighbors. But then as this person moves a few hundred meters farther away from their home, then the share of low-income people is actually much higher. And then when they move a few hundred meters or a few kilometers away from their home, then this percentage drops. Then it drops further. And this is what we call a distance profile. That is a range of, these are actually our multi-scale measures of population, now shown as one distance profile. So it's actually the spatial, it includes the spatial context of one person measured at a range of 101 different spatial scales. So on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, we have the size of the spatial unit. First is we have the cell, and then we have areas with different radii measured then in kilometers, so up to 10 kilometers. And then we see on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, how the share of low-income people, it can be also anything else, any characteristic of the population, how it changes with the spatial scale. So then another way how to represent this, so is to also use color. So to have one line, so to say, that involves different, it includes 101 small rectangulars in different colors. So this is also, so this is basically another way how to present this, how the share of low-income people changes across scale, but then using the color. So different color, the yellow one is more than blue. It means more low-income people in the area than blue. And the reason why we here use color and we condensed it a little bit, we presented only as one line, is that we want more space for different years. So this is, remember that we also mentioned time, that we want to look at changes over time. So then we can do this for multiple years. Specifically, we did this for 19 years. And then we have, again, the share of low-income people, but then measured both across spatial scale. Again, we have 101 spatial scales, and we have 19 years. So this is, if we focus now on this kind of representation using color, we have here on the horizontal axis, we have scale, spatial scale. On the vertical axis, we have time. And then the figure consists of a large number of small rectangulars. So for example, in this one here, it would be this spatial scale and this year that we can look at. So a lot of data only shown only in one figure. And remember, this is only actually one grid cell in the Netherlands. I mentioned already that we have for the whole country these grid cells. So what is important to note is that we could make, in theory, we could make this kind of graph for 600,000 cells, populated cells in the Netherlands, because for all these cells, you can measure the spatial context at multiple spatial scale and for multiple years. So that really creates a large number of data, and this is only example for one grid cell. And we can then use this for studying segregation by looking at these multiple cells, actually. So what we saw in the previous example of one cell, we look at these all the cells in the Netherlands. And for each spatial scale and for each year, we calculate the dissimilarity index, which is well known in the literature. So I think I don't need to go into much detail, but I would like to say that we did, in order to study both ethnic and socioeconomic segregation, we calculated both the segregation of Western versus non-Western people and low income versus the rest of the labor force. And here in this study, in this talk, I want to focus on 4 cities. So we are doing this for the whole country of the Netherlands, but here we would like to focus on these cities to look at differences between the following cities. The 3 of them, they are part of the largest conurbation in the Netherlands, which is Randstad, and it's located here. And it includes, from our study, it includes Amsterdam, Utrecht, and Rotterdam. But we also look at Groningen, which is located in the north of the country in a more rural area. So then remember this graph that we saw only for one cell. We now calculate the dissimilarity index using all the cells in Amsterdam. And then instead of, we used to have the share of, for example, share of low income people showed that is represented by the color at a specific scale in a specific year. And now this is the dissimilarity index. So now each rectangular in this figure represents one dissimilarity index for a specific spatial scale and for a specific year. And we can then compare, we use the same color ramp to compare ethnic and socioeconomic segregation in Amsterdam. And what we can see, so if you look at the changes at the horizontal axis, then we see changes across spatial scale. For example, that here we start with the higher level of segregation, and then it becomes lower. But then we also look at temporal changes, which means that, for example, for ethnic segregation, the scale over time is becoming bigger. So you can see that, for example, at the lowest spatial, here at a few hundred meters, we had a bit lower segregation in the beginning of our study period, but then it becomes a bit higher. So the level of segregation is becoming a bit higher. For socioeconomic segregation, this is in Amsterdam less prominent, so we don't really see this kind of trend. And it's also that the overall segregation in Amsterdam, socioeconomic segregation, is lower than ethnic segregation. Then we can compare this with other cities. So what we saw in Amsterdam doesn't really work now for Rotterdam, because here we see that actually over time, the scale of ethnic segregation is becoming smaller in Rotterdam. And we also see a little bit higher segregation, and also slightly growing the socioeconomic segregation. It's a bit in Rotterdam, a bit higher than in Amsterdam, and it's slightly growing over time. The scale is increasing over time. In Utrecht, this is also even more prominent, because you can see here that over time, towards the end of our study period, we really have now, I hope that you can see on your screens that you can distinguish between this color that here is becoming more and more green. That means, remember, here we are using this color ramp, so then the green means it means higher level of segregation. So in Utrecht, we really see this trend of growing socioeconomic segregation. And similar to Rotterdam, the ethnic segregation the scale of ethnic segregation is becoming smaller. Then we also have Groningen, which is different, as I said, from other cities, because it doesn't belong to the conurbation of Randstad. And it has, particularly at smaller scales of a few hundred kilometers, it already had at the beginning of our study period, it has it has higher levels of segregation comparing to the other cities. So we also did this for the whole country. Remember that we focused on these 4 cities, but we also want to examine in more detail the trends at the national level. And just to compare each city with what is going on at the national level. Here, the color ramp is a bit different. You see that there is an additional color because the color ramp is a little bit, it's wider, of course, because we are now including the whole country. So just to know that there is an additional, the whole range is a little bit wider here, but still we can, this is useful because we can see the overall trends for the whole country, and that I hope that you can see that here the blue is becoming a bit more prominent. So this at the national level we have a similar trend to what we saw in Utrecht, that the socioeconomic segregation is growing, that it's taking up a larger spatial scale, while the ethnic segregation is the scale is becoming smaller. And overall, you can see that ethnic segregation in the Netherlands is much higher than socioeconomic segregation. So this part, so this is the first part regarding the segregation, to wrap up a little bit before we move to to the consequences of this segregation. So what we learned here about the segregation is that both levels of ethnic and socioeconomic segregation are rather low in the Netherlands. Here I am comparing it really maybe to generally to the literature from both Europe and US. In the Netherlands, segregation is not particularly high, but it is important that it varies greatly across spatial scale, and that at some scales, especially the smaller one, especially regarding ethnic segregation, we had a little bit higher segregation. And generally, ethnic segregation is bigger than socioeconomic segregation, especially at a smaller spatial scale. And the reason why we look at these different cities is that we wanted to show different trends, and we did indeed find different different spatial temporal trends of how ethnic segregation is developing in different ways in some cities comparing to the other ones. And then one of the most important findings, especially for the study that is coming after this one, is that socioeconomic segregation is slightly increasing, taking up larger spatial scales. So one of the reasons why we are studying this segregation, if you remember from the beginning of the talk, that we have different consequences of residential segregation, and one of the consequences is that that spatial context generally can affect individual outcomes of people. So in one of our studies, we want to focus on this individual outcome of people, so how they develop over time and how the spatial context of people develop over time, and then how it affects individual outcomes of people. This is complex because if you look at this multiple spatial scale in time, and at the same time people move between neighborhoods and neighborhood change over time, this creates, of course, a huge amount of data, and requires some ways, of course, to summarize, like we did, to visualize our data like we did in previous studies, but also we want to model how this all affects individual outcomes of people. And to illustrate this complexity of studying how spatial context affects individual outcomes of people, is that we are going to look now at the individual residential history of one person in 19 years and at 101 spatial scales. So this is one part of this would be one part of the graph that we saw previously describing one neighborhood. But the reason why we are presenting it only in part for the first few years is because this person lived in this neighborhood only for a certain period of time. And then we have all this complexity that we previously saw, all these scales and all these years. But then this person only lived for a few years and then they moved to another neighborhood. So then for the next period of a few years, we have a different neighborhood that again has this spatial context at multiple spatial scales, and they all change over time, of course. And then this person moves again and then lives in a third neighborhood during their residential history. And that third neighborhood again has different patterns of both spatial and temporal trends. We want to model this. So again, this was only example of one person, but we want to model this for, we did this for all men living in urban regions of the Netherlands. And we looked at how spatial contexts where they live, specifically how the share of low-income people in their spatial context and multiple spatial scale, how it affects their individual income from work. And we included, we control for education and the type of households, for example, and what is a few other characteristics of these people, of course, but the main interest is in the effect of the spatial context on their income. And what is also crucial here is what we call our bespoke scale term, is that we take into account that spatial context, they are becoming increasingly large and increasingly overlapping. And we use this square distance, which belongs to the family of distance decays function. We also included this in our model to take into account that the scales of the spatial context, that the spatial context, that they are becoming increasingly large and overlapping. And here, I want to present the results of the modeling for these 4 urban regions. And what you see here is how the effect of the share of low-income people on individual income changes across spatial scales for these 4 urban regions. So again, here we have scale. Here we have the coefficient. So the coefficient is the effect of the share of low-income people on individual income, and then how it changes over scale. Here we have people that never moved from the region of Amsterdam, so the whole urban region, then Rotterdam, Utrecht, and Groningen. And we generally see that the effect is rather small, but still it changes across spatial scale. What is also interesting, what we can read in the literature, often in literature, that the neighborhood effects is the biggest at the smaller spatial scales, but here we see that it's not really the smaller spatial scale, but it's a slightly bigger one. So it is, that's why we argue that it is really important to examine these effects at a range of spatial scale. We see also that this happens at different scales in different urban regions. What is also interesting in this is this slightly positive effect at some scales. For example, if you look at Utrecht, we interpreted this as the fact that we need to take into account a range of different spatial processes. For example, that the share of low-income people, that people's income can change over time, but also the spatial inequalities can change even faster in their context. And what you saw, if you remember from our graphs about segregation, is that in Utrecht particularly, socioeconomic segregation has been increasing, and that we think that this also has an effect that this might be causing this slightly positive effect. But if we remember our theoretical approach from the beginning, all these spatial processes that are involved, all these mechanisms that are involved that we can learn about from the literature of neighborhood effects, then we also need to look at a very small spatial scales, which is also our contribution because we started from very small spatial scales. So the conclusions about this part, specifically about the spatial contextual effect that we saw in this study, is that the neighborhood effects depend not only on choosing spatial scales, but also on choosing scale in specific settings, because we saw 4 graphs that were slightly different for this 4 urban region. And as I said, also that most of the literature is showing that the neighborhood effects is the biggest at the small scale, but this is not necessarily the case. And also I mentioned different processes that might be operating at the smaller spatial scale, or the growing socioeconomic inequalities or segregation at a larger spatial scale. So we really need to think how we can associate different effects at different scales with different spatial processes. And in the end, why we are here talking about contextual effects and not necessarily about neighborhood effects, as it is the most common term, is that we have all these different scales in different regions. So there is no really single neighborhood effects, but rather many different contextual effects. And to sum up our methodological approach that we saw from the beginning about these multi-scale measures of population, and about our study on segregation, on the spatiotemporal trends of segregation in the Netherlands, and then finally about our study on contextual effect, we can say that we contributed to the literature, but by using this multi-scale approach in spatiotemporal analysis, that we show that in order to understand the spatiotemporal trends, you really need multiple scales. You need multi-scale measures of population. And specifically about segregation and looking at these different spatiotemporal trends, we show that the trends are different for ethnic and socioeconomic segregation. And looking at this range of spatial scales, from the very small one to bigger ones, we need we need to integrate different theoretical approaches in order to understand both processes from a very small spatial scale, such as maybe peer group effects, up to a larger spatial scales where we are talking more about changing trend, about, for example, growing socioeconomic inequalities in an urban regions. By looking at these multiple spatial scales, we argue that we should rather talk about spatial contextual effects than about single neighborhood effects. And eventually, we were talking about these different spatial units, specifically about these multiple spatial scales, about which you can also read a lot in the literature on modifiable areal unit problems, where it is mostly described as a problem. But in our studies, we actually try to use this more as a resource than a problem, and to use it as a resource to better understand the residential segregation and contextual effects. So these are once again the publications that I used in our talk, and the study about segregation is now developing, and hopefully it will also be published at some point. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that there were some comments and questions that I can answer.
I'm sure we have at least 4 questions here, and I'm sure that there will be more coming. If you wanted to stop sharing your screen for now, we can always put it back up if we need to. Then I think, I'm not sure how it looks to our audience, but I think our faces will be a little bit clearer to those who are watching.
Yes, just a second.
So I see 4 questions in here, and then you could, if the audience wants to, feel free to add in. We've got a good 20 minutes for conversation, so this is fantastic. Okay, excellent. So if you want, Anna, you can open the Q&A box at the bottom. I'll read the questions so that everyone can see them, and I'll sort of work through as they get upvoted. I'm going to take them from sort of top to bottom, hoping to reach a diversity of people in the audience. But the first question comes from Elizabeth Dalmel, who says, great presentation. Did you look at any outcomes of ethnic segregation? Is small scale ethnic segregation negative or positive if residents are potentially better able to form social networks and may more gently assimilate? What would be the policy suggestions for ethnic segregation at various scales?
Thank you very much for this comment and the questions. That is really interesting because we are still working on this. We started working in the specifically in the studies on contextual effect. So far we only looked at the effect of the share of low-income people. So it's really focusing on the effect of socioeconomic segregation. But the reason why we are studying both ethnic and socioeconomic segregation, we want to look at the effects of both of them. And we are now working on this. So I think for now, I cannot say anything about the effects of ethnic segregation. So for now, both of these 2 kinds of segregation are both at the level of exploring. So we are really now studying segregation. And as for the effects, I only could show these effects of the socioeconomic one, but we will be working, we are planning to work. So these are, of course, valuable comments for us to continue working on the effects of ethnic segregation. But I can not really say how it affects. I wouldn't now really argue without any results.
You're very cautious. It is interesting to think about the extent to which different degrees of mixture might have different effects for different groups. So we tend to think of it as black and white, that if you're in a very homogeneous neighborhood, that this is either positive or very negative. But of course, it's probably continuous and mediated by who you are as an individual, which is probably age, but also background. So it's very interesting.
Yes, now that you mentioned age as well, we want to look not only at ethnic and socioeconomic segregation, but we want to look at age as well, which is also relevant, I think, and other characteristics of people. So this is really multi-scale measures of population is really measuring everything that is relevant for different questions.
And there's been some nice research, maybe mostly in the US context, but looking at not just whether or not someone is foreign born or age, but actually how long they've been in the location and the age at which they entered the country, because that tends to be a really important piece of information. Well, I'm going to hold my questions because if I talk too much, Anna, we won't get to anyone else's questions. So the next question is from Iman Zeid, who says, thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting. And she asks, why did you decide to use a radius of kilometers rather than the neighborhood boundary or streets as a spatial unit?
Yes, so the neighborhood boundaries, we have officially defined neighborhoods which are available at 2 levels in the Netherlands. So they were only offering us two spatial scales, so that was quite limited for us. We wanted more spatial scales. This way we could really use small increments, which is 100 meters. So we start from the cell and then we increase a little bit and we come to 10 kilometers. But the suggestions about street, it's very interesting. That can also be created instead of using really Euclidean distance, which we are now using. You can look at street networks. that complicates the analysis a little bit. So that really requires even more computation. This was really also a lot of computation, even only for the Euclidean distance, which is just a simple radius. And if you want to look at street networks, that would be even more, I think it would require very complex GIS analysis to take into account all kinds of streets. And we could also look at, we often get comments, we should look at some boundaries in the built environment, or some important roads or rivers. In the Netherlands, there are a lot of canals, and so that is of course relevant, and we do acknowledge that, but maybe for some other even more complex analysis.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on Iman's question, it would be interesting to see the nexus at which neighborhood boundaries or other administrative boundaries actually are important for particular outcomes, and ones for which it doesn't seem to matter what the unit is, that distance is sort of helping to frame that context.
There are some very interesting results on this exact topic about administrative boundaries for hospital catchment areas and how they enforce access and outcome issues with health-related things. Of course, all that happened before COVID, so maybe it's time to redraw those lines additionally. But yeah, it's a fascinating concept there.
We have so many good questions today. Anna, you're getting one of our best weeks for a conversation on the Q&A. This is fantastic. Keep it coming. The next question comes from Noah Bouchier, I hope I'm saying this correctly, who says, thanks for the fascinating talk. You talked about the modifiable aerial unit problem and how administrative boundaries make high resolution analysis more difficult. This is the previous question a little bit. As our methods of analyzing demographics become more advanced, including multi-level measures you've discussed today, is there still space for data that aggregates to a more coarse scale, such as the UK census or probably any census? Or would you say that researchers fundamentally require high resolution data to get a good idea of socioeconomic patterns like segregation?
Yes, that is. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I think that starting also from bigger ones like output, I think you have output areas in the UK that you can also aggregate them, maybe start from the smallest one that you have, and then it is possible to apply this particular method to some extent, even to bigger areas by aggregating them up to larger areas, because I think that it is relevant to look at larger. We are not just we are arguing that it is important to look at different scales, not necessarily really small, although the small one can be important for some particular mechanism. So if you are, I am happy that this microgeographic data is increasingly available in Europe that people can use. And if they don't have them, I think that some, maybe some assessing some values within the administrative unit that you have, there are also ways to assess it if you don't really have very accurate data. We were also participating, now I didn't show, but we were participating in a project called Data Challenge of the European Commission, where for multiple countries, these kind of microgeographic data, 100 by 100 meters, were offered, but they were not all from registered data in the Netherlands. They were not really accurate coordinates, but they use a lot of complex methods again to assess the numbers of people using buildings and land use, and combining it with census. I do think that small scale is important, but of course, if you don't have it, there are different methods. I think that it is valuable, the different areas that you have in the UK. There are also, of course, I wouldn't say it's not possible to study segregation with them, of course, and they are also useful, but if there are methods to get data on a small spatial scale, that's like an addition. That is something that would enrich your analysis, I would say.
Yeah, I think most of us who work in spatial analysis seem to feel usually that the more control and the greater articulation, the better for data. But for those who were here for David Van Riper's talk right before Christmas, where we talked about differential privacy in the US Census case, you sort of, the smaller the unit, the more you run up against the issues around privacy and confidentiality. And I think we're on a little bit of a collision course right now as demographic researchers in this sort of trade-off between having good geographies and still protecting individuals and encouraging them to provide their information. Okay, the next question is from Nick Bristow, who says, "Hi, Anna, thanks very much for your talk. I have a slightly naive question. I'm not an expert in this field. Wouldn't you see more in your visualizations if you were to use a logarithmic scale for the distance radius? Is there a reason why you stuck to a linear scale?"
Thank you so much for this suggestion. Yes, we wanted actually to examine the area as it is, so maybe to see what happens really if you use a larger scale. For example, what we are seeing in our area with a few kilometers would be similar to what you get if you use administrative unit at the scale that are normally available. So we wanted to replicate really what happens in the reality if you use larger and smaller unit as they are. Then of course you can apply, for example, in our study on contextual effects, we included this distance decay to take into account that the areas are larger and increasingly overlapping. So I think that there are different ways, of course, to look at this increasing spatial scale. This would be one option, but as I said, the reason why we are using just a linear scale is that we want to replicate kind of the areas that we have in reality, that people are using, the smaller and the bigger ones.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Evelyn van Leeuwen, who asks about interdependence between different scales, and if you have ideas how to deal with that.
Yes, thank you. This is really exactly the why we introduced this bespoke scale term in the study of contextual effect, because if you use them as they are, then you are really, especially at a larger scale, you are throwing into the model something that is also overlapping. So we took into account that by using this squared distance. That for that there were also different options, because in the family of distance decay functions there were different options. But then we thought this is the most accepted common one. This is a way how to, and it also the squared distance reflects how different are the areas, because if you calculate the formula for calculating the area of the circle, it involves square distance. So it's proportional to the area of the circle with a certain radius. Square distance is in the formula. So that's why we took this one. This is how we took it into account in the neighborhood effect study. And I think if you decide to, depending on your research question or what you want to model, then you can decide how to take into account that the areas are overlapping, that they are also dependent. Yes.
Thanks. The next question is from Yi Chang, who says, "Excellent talk," and has a question about the location of city center in different cities, and asks, how does the location of city center affect analysis results?
We looked at this, so we looked basically at every single location as the spatial context of a certain people. So we didn't really take into account that they live close, or that could be maybe one of the one area of improvement. For example, often we get comments that the spatial context of a person is not really a circle, that people maybe go more towards one direction than the other. So that is something that we could also take into account, maybe to measure some asymmetry in the circles and in the context. But we were thinking a lot about this, and it was, as I said, only calculating this is quite demanding. But of course, there must be some way to take into account. It's an interesting approach to take, either the city center or also to investigate whether people are actually going more, maybe through some questionnaires or other sources where they actually, which direction they actually move.
Yeah. We don't have any other questions. We have a comment from Pedro Amaral, who says, very interesting presentation and nice visualizations. Thank you. I wanted to make sure that you saw that. This was an excellent presentation. Levi, did you have a question?
I did, yeah. So your use of the, as you say, the modifiable areal unit problem as a sort of interrogation technique rather than a problem in and of itself is really innovative. And it brings to mind a paper that I love by Gary King, an American political scientist at Harvard, who wrote back in the 1990s that the modifiable areal unit problem is actually a theoretical problem, and most geographers just attempt to address its empirical effects through things like regionalization and enforcing a consistent size. So I was wondering, with that in mind, with this kind of really innovative multi-scale analysis, what serious theoretical issue with the MAUP do you see it solving? Like, how do you envision this kind of, in a broad sense, tackling scale as a geographical problem?
Yes, thank you. That's very interesting, and that is what we deal with in our theoretical paper. The figure that I started, where we summarized this, well, not really summarized, but where we presented a few different mechanisms of contextual effects and how they, what is the likelihood that they operate at a certain spatial scale. So we tried to address this issue in that paper, and specifically with that figure. I think that should be our starting point, that we really need to connect different mechanisms or different processes with different scales. And I agree that this is more a theoretical problem, and the reason why we are not seeing it as a problem is because it should not be the problem that the context changes. It is the way it is because of certain reasons. So you need to investigate why the context is changing as you change the scale, what are the consequences, and how you can explain in that. And by explaining it is then you are dealing with theory, because you're looking at different processes. So it's really connecting with theory. We only started this in our theoretical paper from the progress, but of course I think there is much more to say about this.
That's super. Yeah, I do think that that's the kind of what the quote from the Gibbons and Overman mostly pointless spatial econometrics paper is, specifying testable hypotheses about processes. And that's what we're all here for, right? So I think it's excellent that you have this critical attention to what scale is actually doing, which calls back to some of these earlier voices from outside geography talking about how geography looks to them. I just think it's ace. Very good. So,
thank you.
Great talk.
I had maybe a question, but actually more asking if you could speculate a little bit. We've had a lot of talks this year in our seminar series on mobility and movement. And it sometimes can seem like we have two different conversations that are happening that really should be converging more, in that if we really want to understand outcomes for individuals, either their perceptions or actual outcomes as measured in terms of employment or education or health, we need to understand much more about how people move through space. And that's about knowing more about who individuals are and disentangling what it means to be younger or older or have a different sort of background, and how your context may shift with that. But it's also the fact that we navigate, most of us, through space during the day, and that probably at some point affects outcomes. And I just wonder, do you have ideas about sort of how we start to think about mobility and how people are actually using their local space in order to get finer grained measures, or more realistic measures, I suppose, of how context is affecting outcomes?
Yes, this is also, I think, one of the common comments that we get, that we only look at the residential environment of the person while the person is moving during the day, and also during the year or some other periods of time. You can see really the different patterns of activity spaces. But here we are only looking at residential space, I think that we could actually combine this by looking at these multiple scales around different locations of that are included in these activity spaces of people, for example, around their workplace or around other places where they spend time, but then also to look at multiple scales. But I do agree that we should look at activity spaces. This was not, so we didn't intend to say that we, by using, for example, the larger scale, that we included the activity space of the person, but it was more the context when they are around their home. Of course, we do acknowledge that they might spend some time in another city, or but then we need more information, and that makes the analysis more complex. But I do agree that some different approaches, they need to be combined in a way that we should not really focus only on multiple scales in the residential space, and then on the other hand look at mobility only using single scales, but we try to combine them somehow.
Well, it's good. You're at the beginning of your career, so it's good if there's lots of work still to be done. It would be terrible if you were done now and had to look for something new to do. I see a few thank yous in the Q&A, also from Evelien van Leeuwen saying, good job on your presentation. But I think that's it for questions, unless Levi wanted to add anything.
No, I'm good. Thanks. That was an excellent presentation in Q&A. Thanks a lot, Anna.
Thank you, audience. Well done, audience, for fantastic questions and conversation today.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments and questions.
Before we split up, I'd like to remind everybody that these are weekly events. However, we won't have a talk next week. We will have a talk in 2 weeks by Dylan Connor on the sociospatial structure of community change in rural areas in the US. So thanks a lot for coming, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks for Dylan Connor. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.